The Blackwood Tower had been empty for 37 years when Sarah Chen pulled up to its rusted gates, her beat-up Honda struggling up the overgrown driveway. At 8 months pregnant and down to her last $100, the $40 foreclosure auction seemed like a miracle until she pushed open the heavy wooden door. The air inside wasn't stale like an abandoned building should be. It was warm, fresh, like someone had just been breathing it. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly as her old instincts kicked in, the same ones that had made her the youngest paranormal investigator in the Bureau's history before she quit 5 years ago, before the incident that nearly killed her. Now, standing in the tower's main hall, she could feel them again, the whispers that weren't quite voices, the shadows that moved without light, and something else, something that knew she was pregnant, something that had been waiting. The floorboards above her head creaked in a rhythm that sounded almost like a lullaby. But who or what had been living in this abandoned tower all these years? Sarah forced herself to take a deep breath, fighting the familiar surge of adrenaline that used to fuel her investigations. She couldn't afford to run. Not anymore. The eviction notice was crumpled in her car, and this tower, however wrong it felt, was the only roof she could put over her head before the baby came. She pulled out her phone, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The main hall stretched before her, impossibly grand for a structure that had sold for pocket change. Stone walls rose 20 feet to an arched ceiling, and a spiral staircase wound upward into darkness. Dust motes danced in her light, but there was something off about their movement. They swirled in patterns too deliberate, too purposeful. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, making her gasp. In all her months of pregnancy, her child had never been this active. It was as if something in this place had awakened it. "Just old pipes," she whispered, though she knew the rhythmic creaking above had nothing to do with plumbing. She'd heard enough supernatural phenomena in her 5 years with the Bureau to recognize the difference between settling foundations and something else entirely. A draft touched her neck, carrying the scent of roses and something underneath it, something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. She'd smelled it before, during her last case, the one that ended everything. Sarah forced the memory away and stepped deeper into the hall. Her footsteps echoed, but the echoes came back wrong, distorted, as if the sound was being shaped by unseen hands before it returned to her ears. The beam of her flashlight caught something on the far wall, a portrait in an ornate frame. She approached it slowly, her investigator's training warring with her desperate need to believe this place could be home. The painting showed a woman in Victorian dress, pale and beautiful, holding a swaddled infant. But as Sarah drew closer, she realized the bundle in the woman's arms was empty, the fabric wrapped around nothing at all. Behind her, a floorboard groaned. She spun around, heart hammering, but the hall was empty. The dust motes had stopped their strange dance and now hung motionless in her light. "Hello?" The word slipped out before she could stop it, a reflex from her old profession. Never call out, they'd taught her at the Bureau, don't invite contact. But the silence that followed was worse than any response could have been. Her phone buzzed with a text. The screen showed her ex-partner Miguel's name, saw the news about Blackwood Tower. "That place sold? Sarah, please tell me you weren't desperate enough to—" She deleted the message without reading the rest. Miguel still worked cases, still believed she'd come back someday. He didn't understand that some things couldn't be faced twice, that some scars ran too deep to heal. The baby kicked again, and this time Sarah could swear she felt something kick back, not from inside her, from outside, as if something had pressed its hand against her belly through her coat. She jerked away from the wall she'd been leaning against and found herself staring at the stone. Carved into its surface, so faint she almost missed it, were symbols she recognized. Protective wards, but they were incomplete, broken. And they were old, much older than 37 years. A new sound drifted down from above, not creaking this time, but humming. A woman's voice, wordless and haunting, threading through the darkness like smoke. The melody was beautiful and terrible, and it made something deep in Sarah's chest resonate in harmony. The baby's movements intensified, pressing against her ribs as if trying to escape, or trying to reach toward the sound. Sarah's hands trembled as she backed toward the door. This wasn't just about finding shelter anymore. Something in this tower had been waiting, just as she'd sensed, waiting for someone like her, someone who would bring it exactly what it wanted. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving only silence and the weight of unseen eyes watching her retreat. The rusted key turned easier than Sarah expected, as if the tower had been waiting for her arrival. The heavy oak door swung open with barely a whisper, revealing a narrow stone corridor that stretched into darkness beyond her phone's flashlight beam. She hesitated at the threshold, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other gripping the door frame. The air inside carried a strange sweetness, like overripe fruit mixed with something medicinal. Sarah forced herself to breathe through her mouth as she stepped inside, her footsteps echoing off the curved walls. The baby kicked, hard, and she paused, wondering if even her unborn child could sense something wrong with this place. "Just old stones and dust," she whispered, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. The main floor was larger than she'd anticipated, a circular room with windows set high in the walls like watchful eyes. Weak afternoon sunlight filtered through glass so thick with grime it turned the light amber. In the center of the space, a spiral staircase wound upward, disappearing into the shadows above. Sarah pulled out her phone and began documenting everything, forcing herself into the familiar routine of assessment and cataloging. The stone walls were in remarkable condition despite decades of abandonment. No water damage, no visible cracks, no evidence of the usual decay that plagued old buildings. If anything, the tower felt preserved, as if time had simply stopped the moment the last occupant left. She climbed the stairs slowly, testing each step. The first landing opened onto what must have been a living area. Furniture sat beneath dust-covered sheets like sleeping ghosts. Sarah lifted one corner of a sheet and revealed an ornate wooden chair, its upholstery still rich burgundy despite the years. Too well preserved, her investigator's mind noted automatically. The baby kicked again, more insistently this time, and Sarah found herself humming softly, an old lullaby her mother used to sing. The melody seemed to echo strangely in the confined space, as if other voices were trying to join in just below the range of hearing. On the second landing, she discovered what might have been a bedroom. An iron bed frame dominated the space, its mattress long since removed. But it was the walls that made her stop breathing for a moment. Scratched into the stone, barely visible in the dim light, were marks. Not random gouges, but deliberate patterns, symbols that tugged at memories she'd tried hard to bury. Sarah stepped closer, tracing one symbol with her finger. The stone was smooth, worn by countless repetitions of the same gesture, a circle intersected by 3 lines with smaller marks radiating outward like reaching fingers or roots spreading underground. "No," she said aloud, dropping her hand. "I'm not doing this anymore." But even as she spoke the denial, her phone was already out, photographing the markings from multiple angles. Old habits died hard, and Sarah's investigative instincts had kept her alive through situations that would have broken lesser people. The symbols were definitely intentional, carved with precision and purpose. They formed a pattern around the room, as if marking boundaries or creating some kind of protective circle. Protection from what? The question formed before she could stop it. The third landing was smaller, clearly meant as a study or private retreat. Here, the windows were larger, offering a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside. Sarah could see her rental car parked below, looking impossibly small and vulnerable. Beyond that, miles of empty fields stretched toward the horizon, broken only by a few scattered farmhouses and the dark line of a distant forest. She was truly alone out here. The nearest neighbor was at least 2 miles away, and the local town, if the cluster of buildings she'd driven through could be called that, was even farther. Perfect for a fresh start, she'd thought when she first saw the listing. Perfect for privacy. Now, standing in the tower's upper reaches with those symbols burned into her memory, the isolation felt less like freedom and more like exposure. The final staircase was narrower, leading to what had once been the tower's crown. Sarah climbed carefully, her breathing labored from the exertion and her growing unease. At the top, she emerged into a circular room ringed entirely by windows. It should have been bright, cheerful even, but something about the space felt wrong. The windows faced every direction, offering a commanding view of the entire surrounding area. But they also meant that anyone or anything in this room would be visible from all sides. It felt less like a retreat and more like a watchtower or a display case. Sarah walked the perimeter slowly, noting that one window had a different view than the others. While most looked out over fields and forest, this one faced a section of the nearby woods that seemed unusually dark. Even in the afternoon sun, the trees there appeared to swallow light rather than reflect it. As she stared into that patch of darkness, the baby gave another sharp kick, and for just a moment Sarah could have sworn she saw something move among the distant trees, something tall and pale, watching the tower with the same intensity that she was watching it. The morning light filtering through the grimy windows revealed just how much work lay ahead. Sarah stood in what had once been the tower's main living space, her breath visible in the frigid air as she surveyed the damage. Water stains bloomed across the walls like abstract art, and sections of floorboards sagged ominously beneath her feet. She'd slept fitfully in her car, too unsettled by the previous night's experience to remain inside. But daylight brought rationality. The sounds, the whispers, pregnancy hormones could cause auditory hallucinations. She'd researched it thoroughly during her first trimester, when phantom crying had kept her awake for weeks. Dr. Martinez had assured her it was normal, just another delightful side effect of carrying a child. Sarah pulled her tablet from her bag and began documenting the necessary repairs. New windows, obviously. The heating system needed complete replacement. The kitchen, if the collection of rusted pipes and rotting cabinets could be called that, required gutting. As she worked, cataloguing each problem, she felt more like her old self. Methodical, logical, in control. The baby shifted inside her, a gentle rolling movement that made her pause. At 32 weeks, these movements had become her anchor to normalcy. Whatever supernatural nonsense her mind might conjure, this little person was real, growing stronger every day. "Just you and me, kiddo," she whispered, one hand on her belly. "We can handle some old house creaks." She climbed the narrow stone steps to the second floor, testing each one carefully. The stairs seemed solid enough, though the iron railing had rusted through in several places. Upstairs, she found 3 rooms, 2 that might serve as bedrooms, and a third that could become a nursery. The nursery-to-be faced east, and even through the grime-coated window, she could see it would get beautiful morning light. Sarah was measuring the space when she heard footsteps below. She froze, listening, heavy boots on the wooden floor, moving with purpose through the rooms she'd just vacated. Relief flooded through her, probably someone from town coming to check on the new owner. Small communities were like that. "Hello?" she called down the stairwell. "I'm upstairs." The footsteps stopped. Sarah waited but heard nothing more. No response, no continued movement. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. "Hello?" She tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Every instinct from her paranormal investigation days screamed at her to stay put, but Sarah forced herself to move. Pregnant women weren't supposed to live in fear of creaky houses and mysterious sounds. She descended the stairs slowly, one hand on the wall for balance. The main floor appeared empty. Dust motes danced in the morning sunbeams, and her own footprints from earlier were clearly visible in the grime. But there, near the front door, were other prints. Large boot prints, definitely not hers, the edges sharp and recent. Sarah's heart began to race. She pulled out her phone, checking for signal. 1 bar, enough. She was scrolling through her contacts when she heard the voice. Sarah, her name, spoken clearly from somewhere behind her. A man's voice, unfamiliar, coming from the direction of the kitchen. "Who's there?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "This is private property." Silence. But as she stood there, phone clutched in her trembling hand, she became aware of something else. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Her breath had begun to fog again, and frost was actually forming on the inside of the windows. In October, at 10 in the morning, the baby kicked hard, as if sensing her distress. The sharp movement made Sarah gasp and instinctively step backward toward the door. "I know you can hear me," she said to the empty air, hating how her voice shook. "Whatever this is, whatever you want, I'm not the same person I used to be. I don't investigate anymore. I don't help spirits cross over or solve supernatural mysteries. I just want to live quietly with my child." The response was immediate and terrifying. Every loose object in the room, bits of debris, a rusted can, several stones that had fallen from the walls, rose into the air simultaneously. They hovered for a moment, defying gravity, before crashing to the floor in a cacophony that made Sarah cry out. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went still. The temperature returned to normal. The frost on the windows melted and began to drip. Even the dust seemed to settle back into its previous patterns. Sarah stood frozen for several seconds before her survival instincts kicked in. She grabbed her bag and tablet, moving as quickly as her pregnant body allowed toward the door. As she reached for the handle, she heard it one more time. Her name, spoken so softly it might have been the wind. But there was no wind, and Sarah knew, with the terrible certainty that had once made her excellent at her job, that whatever lived in this tower knew exactly who she was. Sarah's hands trembled as she scrolled through the archived newspaper articles on her laptop, the glow from the screen casting eerie shadows across the tower's main room. She'd spent the morning boarding up the broken windows and sweeping away decades of debris, but now, as evening approached, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The first article made her stomach clench. "Local family dies in tower fire, 1954. A grainy photograph showed the same circular stone structure she now called home, but intact, with smoke billowing from its upper windows. The Hartwell family, mother, father, and their 3 young children, had all perished. Only the pregnant mother, Elena Hartwell, had survived long enough to be rushed to the hospital, where she died during an emergency cesarean section. The baby had been stillborn. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where her own child stirred restlessly. The coincidence felt too deliberate, too pointed. She clicked to the next article, dated 6 months later. "Second tragedy strikes cursed tower. Another family had attempted to renovate the structure. Another pregnant woman had died under mysterious circumstances, this time falling from the tower's highest window. Again, the baby hadn't survived." The pattern continued through decades of records. 1967, Margaret Austin, 7 months pregnant, found at the bottom of the tower, spiral staircase with a broken neck. 1983, Jennifer Walsh discovered in the tower's basement, apparently having bled to death from unexplained wounds. 1995, Lisa Chen, who'd vanished for 3 days before being found in the tower, catatonic and miscarrying. Each woman had been drawn to the tower during pregnancy. Each had died before giving birth. And according to the property records Sarah accessed next, the tower had been sold and resold repeatedly, always for suspiciously low prices, always to young couples expecting their first child. A sound from above made her freeze, a soft scratching, like fingernails against stone. Sarah closed the laptop and grabbed the flashlight she'd placed beside her makeshift bed. The scratching stopped the moment she moved, but the silence felt expectant. "Hungry. I know what you are," she whispered into the darkness. "And I know what you want." Her paranormal investigation days had taught her that most supernatural entities were predictable once you understood their patterns. This thing, whatever it was, had been feeding on unborn children for 70 years. But why? What was it gaining? And more importantly, how had it been luring pregnant women to this isolated place decade after decade? The scratching resumed, more insistent now, accompanied by what sounded like footsteps moving in slow circles around the room above. Sarah forced herself to remain still, to think. During her investigative career, she'd encountered entities that fed on fear, on pain, on life force itself. But this felt different, more focused, more desperate. Her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "The baby will be safe with me. I've been waiting so long." Ice flooded Sarah's veins. She'd left her phone downstairs, and there was no cell signal in the tower. She looked at the device in her hand, her own phone, displaying a message that shouldn't exist. Another buzz. "Elena is lonely. The others didn't stay. But you're different. You understand." Elena, the first pregnant woman to die here back in 1954. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Vengeful spirit? Demonic entity using Elena's identity? Or something worse, the actual soul of Elena Hartwell, driven mad by decades of supernatural imprisonment? The footsteps above grew louder, joined by what sounded like sobbing. Sarah grabbed her emergency bag and checked its contents: iron filings, salt, sage, a silver-bladed knife, and holy water from 3 different denominations. Old habits died hard. "You can't leave," appeared on her phone screen without the device making any sound. "I've been preparing for this baby. I know how to keep this one safe." Sarah typed back, "What happened to you, Elena?" The response came immediately. "I never got to hold my baby, never got to protect him, but I can protect yours. I can keep it safe forever." The scratching evolved into violent clawing sounds, as if something with long nails was trying to tear through the wooden floor above. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Through the gaps between floorboards, Sarah glimpsed movement, a pale shape wearing what looked like a hospital gown from decades past. "I've kept all the others safe," the next message read. "In the walls, in the foundation. They're sleeping peacefully. Your baby will have playmates." Horror washed over Sarah as she understood. The entity wasn't killing the babies out of malice, it was collecting them, stealing them from their mothers to create some twisted, supernatural nursery in the space between worlds. She stood slowly, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the iron-filled pouch in her bag. "Elena," she called softly, "I want to help you. But first, you need to let the children go." The scratching stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Sarah could swear she heard the sound of infants crying somewhere far below. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of the tower's upper level, casting long shadows across the wooden floor as Sarah climbed the narrow spiral staircase. She'd barely slept after her encounter with Marcus, her mind churning with fragments of half-remembered training and the growing certainty that whatever lived in this place had been watching her far longer than she'd realized. Her hand pressed against her belly as the baby kicked, a sharp jab that made her pause on the steps. "I know, little one," she whispered. "Mama's going to figure this out." The upper floor had once been a library or study, its walls lined with built-in shelves that now held only dust and the occasional remnant of a book's spine. But it was the far corner that drew her attention, a section where the floorboards were newer than the rest, as if something had been replaced or repaired. Sarah knelt carefully, running her fingers along the seams. The wood gave slightly under pressure, and she realized these boards weren't nailed down. They'd been cut to fit precisely, creating a hidden compartment beneath. She pried up the first board with her fingernails, then the second. The space below was shallow but wide, containing a leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth and what appeared to be a collection of photographs. Her hands trembled as she lifted them out. The journal's cover bore the initials M in faded gold lettering. Sarah opened it carefully, squinting at the spidery handwriting on the yellowed pages. May 15th, 1962. "Mother says I'm imagining things, but I know what I saw in the cellar. The shadows don't move like shadows should. They reach, they whisper, and they know about the baby." Sarah's blood chilled. She flipped through more pages, finding entries that spanned several months. June 2nd, 1962. "Dr. Henley says the pregnancy is progressing normally, but I feel it, the thing downstairs, growing stronger as the baby grows. It feeds on the life I'm creating. I've started researching the tower's history. What I've found, Several pages had been torn out. Sarah continued reading, her hands shaking. August 8th, 1962. I found the records in the town archives. 7 women before me, 7 pregnancies, all lost in the 8th month. The pattern goes back to 1847, when they built this cursed place on the ruins of something older, something that was never properly buried. The photographs scattered across her lap as Sarah fumbled with the journal. She picked up one, a black and white image of a young woman with dark hair, visibly pregnant, standing in front of the tower. The woman's eyes held the same haunted expression Sarah had been seeing in her own reflection. Another photo showed the cellar, but it looked different somehow, larger. The walls seemed to extend further back than they should, disappearing into an impossible darkness. And there, barely visible in the shadows, was a shape that made Sarah's vision blur when she tried to focus on it. August 25th, 1962. I know what it wants. Not just my baby, all the babies. It's been collecting them, storing them in that space between spaces down there. I can hear them sometimes, crying in frequencies that only a mother would recognize. I have to stop this. I have to end it before... The entry cut off mid-sentence. Sarah flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank except for the very last one. For the woman who comes after me, and there will be one, look in the foundation stones. The binding symbols were carved by the original builders, but they've been corrupted. The thing down there learned to twist them, to make them serve its purpose instead of containing it. Find the keystone, break the pattern. A sound from below made Sarah freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, climbing the tower stairs. But these weren't Marcus's heavy boots. These steps were lighter, almost feminine, yet they carried an otherworldly resonance that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls themselves. Sarah quickly gathered the journal and photographs, shoving them into the hidden compartment and replacing the floorboards. She stood just as a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was the woman from the photograph. Ethereal and translucent, her dark hair framed a face that was both beautiful and terrible in its sadness. She wore a dress from the 1960s, her pregnant belly clearly visible beneath the fabric. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. You found my warning. The ghost's eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made the air shimmer. But reading it isn't enough. It's stronger now than it was in my time. The barriers between our world and its realm have worn thin. What does it want? Sarah managed to ask, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. To birth itself into our world. It needs innocent life force to complete the transition. Unborn souls are the purest form. Every pregnancy it claims makes it more solid, more real. The ghost moved closer, and the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. But you're different. You have knowledge the rest of us lacked. I don't know if it's enough. It has to be. The apparition's form began to flicker. Because if it succeeds this time, if it finally gathers enough power to cross over completely, every child ever born will be in danger. The basement stairs groaned under Sarah's weight as she descended into the tower's bowels, her flashlight cutting through darkness thick as velvet. The stone walls wept with condensation, and the air tasted of centuries-old decay. She'd avoided this place for 3 days, but the scratching sounds that echoed up through the floorboards at night had finally driven her down here. Her paranormal investigation toolkit felt foreign in her hands after 2 years of storage. The EMF detector's familiar weight brought back memories she'd tried to bury, midnight vigils in haunted houses, voices from empty rooms, the case that had nearly killed her and made her swear off the supernatural forever. But here she was again, pregnant and alone, hunting ghosts in her own home. The basement stretched further than the tower's circumference should have allowed. Impossible architecture, she noted grimly. Classic signs of a severely haunted location. The flashlight beam revealed rough-hewn stone walls that predated the tower above by centuries. This wasn't just a basement. It was a foundation built on something much older. A soft scraping echoed from the darkness ahead. Sarah froze, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. The baby kicked, as if responding to her tension. "Hello?" Her voice cracked slightly. "I know you're here." The scraping stopped. She moved deeper into the basement, following a narrow corridor that curved along the foundation's perimeter. The EMF detector remained silent until she reached an alcove carved into the eastern wall. Suddenly, the device erupted in sharp beeps, the needle swinging wildly. Sarah raised her flashlight, illuminating the alcove's contents. Her breath caught. Dozens of small wooden cradles lined stone shelves, each carved with intricate symbols that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. Some cradles looked ancient, their wood dark with age. Others appeared newer, though still decades old. All were empty except for rotting fabric that might once have been blankets. At the center of the display sat a leather-bound ledger. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it. Page after page of careful handwriting documented births dating back to 1847. Names, dates, and brief notes filled the columns. Mary Whitmore, delivered October 13th, 1847. Healthy boy, claimed at birth. Margaret Sullivan, delivered December 3rd, 1851. Twin girls, both claimed. The entries continued chronologically, spanning over a century. The final entry was dated 1968, Linda Morrison, delivered September 22nd. Complications during claiming ritual. Mother did not survive. Sarah's legs gave out. She slumped against the stone wall, the ledger falling from nerveless fingers. The tower hadn't been a private residence. It had been a place where desperate women came to give birth, and something had been taking their children for over a century. A new sound drifted through the darkness, soft humming, like a lullaby sung in a language she didn't recognize. The EMF detector's beeping intensified, and the temperature plummeted. Sarah could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The humming grew louder, seeming to come from the walls themselves. Sarah struggled to her feet, backing toward the corridor. But as she turned, she found her path blocked by a figure that hadn't been there moments before. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, draped in tattered robes that might once have been white. Where its face should have been, shadow writhed and pulsed. But it was the thing's arms that made Sarah's blood freeze, elongated and impossibly thin, ending in fingers like twisted branches, and cradled in those horrible arms was something small and still, wrapped in mouldering cloth. "You carry the gift," it said, its voice like wind through dead leaves, as they all did, as you were meant to. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, her flashlight beam passing through the entity without effect. "What do you want?" What was promised long ago, what has always been owed. The thing stepped closer, and Sarah could smell death and old earth radiating from it. The bloodline continues, the compact endures. "I don't know what you're talking about." But even as she said it, fragments of her grandmother's whispered stories began surfacing. Tales of a family debt, of women who vanished for months before returning changed and hollow-eyed. Stories her mother had dismissed as senile rambling. The entity tilted its head. "Your grandmother understood. She brought your mother here, as tradition demanded. But the girl proved unsuitable. Barren ground bears no fruit." Its grip tightened on the bundle in its arms. "You are the bloodline's redemption. Your child will join the others, and the compact will be renewed." Sarah's hand moved to her belly protectively. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing the danger. "No, I won't let you take my child." The thing's laugh was like breaking glass. "You think you have a choice? This place calls to your blood. You came here willingly, as they all did. The tower provides, and the debt must be paid." The basement suddenly filled with whispers. Dozens of voices speaking in unison, women's voices heavy with grief and resignation. Sarah realized with growing horror that she wasn't just facing one entity. She was surrounded by every mother who had lost a child in this place, bound to serve the thing that had stolen their babies. And now it wanted hers. The tower's ancient stones seemed to pulse with malevolent energy as Sarah descended the spiral staircase, her investigative instincts warring with every maternal impulse, screaming at her to flee. The temperature dropped with each step, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Behind her, the journal's pages rustled, though no wind stirred within the enclosed space. She'd read enough of Margaret Blackwood's entries to understand the horrific pattern. The tower wasn't just haunted, it was a feeding ground. Every generation it called to expectant mothers, drawing them with promises of shelter and sanctuary, only to harvest what grew within them for its eternal hunger. The basement door stood ajar, exhaling the scent of damp earth, and something far more disturbing, the sweet, cloying smell of decay mixed with something that reminded her of a nursery. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly as the baby kicked, more violently than ever before. Even her unborn child could sense the wrongness that permeated this place. "I know you're listening," Sarah whispered to the shadows. "I know what you want, but you're not getting it." The responding laughter seemed to emerge from the stones themselves, a sound like grinding bones and dying breath. The temperature plummeted further, and frost began forming on the medieval walls. Sarah's training kicked in as she pulled out her phone, activating the audio recorder. Old habits from her paranormal investigation days that might prove crucial now. Entity present, aggressive manifestation, temperature drop of approximately 30 degrees, she murmured, documenting what might be her final moments. Timestamp 11:47 p.m. Subject appears to be focused on unborn fetus, showing increased activity with my proximity to lower levels. A door slammed somewhere above, then another, the sounds cascading down the tower like dominoes falling. Sarah gripped the iron railing of the staircase, the metal so cold it burned her palm. The journal had mentioned iron as one of the few deterrents, though Margaret's fate proved it wasn't enough on its own. The basement revealed itself as she reached the bottom, a circular chamber that predated even the tower's medieval construction. Roman stonework, she realized, recognizing the distinctive masonry from her archaeological studies. This place had been feeding for far longer than she'd imagined. Arranged around the chamber's perimeter were 13 stone alcoves, each containing the remnants of what had once been cribs. The wood had long since rotted away, leaving only rusted metal frames and fragments of ancient fabric. But in the center of each alcove sat something that made Sarah's blood freeze. Tiny bones, arranged with ritualistic precision. "Dear God," she breathed, her voice echoing in the chamber. The baby's kicks became frantic, as if trying to push away from this place of ultimate wrongness. The entity's presence intensified, no longer hiding behind subtlety. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on an oily quality that made breathing difficult. Sarah felt pressure building against her skull, and whispered words began echoing in her mind. Not her own thoughts, but something ancient and hungry pressing against her consciousness. "Give us the child. End the hunger. Join the others who came before." Images flooded her mind, visions of the women who had stood in this very chamber over the centuries. Celtic druids, Roman matrons, medieval peasants, Victorian ladies and more recent victims wearing the clothes of decades past. All of them drawn by the same desperate circumstances. All of them believing they'd found salvation in the tower's embrace. Sarah fought against the mental intrusion, using techniques she'd learned during her most dangerous investigations. Visualization, mental barriers, focusing on protective symbols and prayers. But this entity was stronger than anything she'd encountered before, fed by centuries of successful harvests. The baby's movements suddenly stopped. Panic flooded through Sarah as she pressed her hands to her belly, feeling for any sign of life. "No, no, no," she whispered frantically. Then, faint but present, she felt a flutter of movement. The entity was trying to claim her child, even while it remained in the womb. Drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Sarah began backing toward the staircase. Each step was a monumental effort against the psychic pressure bearing down on her. The walls began to bleed, not blood but some thick, dark substance that stained the ancient stones. "You took the others because they didn't know what you were," Sarah said through gritted teeth, her voice gaining strength with each word. "But I'm not them. I've fought your kind before, and I know your weaknesses." The laughter returned, but with an edge of uncertainty now. Sarah pulled out the iron cross she'd worn throughout her investigating days, not from religious faith, but because iron had proven effective against supernatural entities. The metal grew warm in her palm, and the oppressive presence lessened slightly. She'd made it halfway up the stairs when the entity's rage exploded around her. The tower itself seemed to scream, stones grinding against stones, and the very air became a weapon trying to drag her back into the feeding chamber below. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of a heartbeat. Sarah's breath misted as she pressed herself against the cold stone wall, listening to the footsteps that shouldn't exist echoing from somewhere above. The old investigator in her catalogued every detail, the deliberate pace, the weight suggesting an adult male, the slight drag of the left foot that spoke of an old injury or deformity. Marcus reached for his phone's flashlight, but Sarah grabbed his wrist, shaking her head. Light would only announce their presence to whatever was moving through the tower's upper levels. She'd learned that lesson the hard way in a Georgian mansion outside Savannah, when her team's eagerness to document had nearly gotten them all killed. The footsteps paused directly overhead, and dust rained down from the ancient wooden beams. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby had gone completely still. Even in the womb, her child seemed to sense the wrongness permeating this place. "We need to leave," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. But Sarah was already moving toward the narrow stone staircase that spiraled up into darkness. Every rational part of her mind screamed to run, to get as far from this place as possible. Yet something deeper, the same instinct that had made her excel at paranormal investigation, compelled her forward. This entity, whatever it was, had been calling to her specifically. It knew about the baby, had somehow orchestrated her finding this place when she was most vulnerable. "Sarah, don't." Marcus caught her arm, his grip desperate. "You're pregnant. This isn't your job anymore." She turned to face him, and he stepped back at what he saw in her eyes. The Sarah he'd known these past 3 years, the woman who'd sworn off the supernatural, who'd built a quiet life selling antiques and restoring furniture, had vanished. In her place stood someone harder, more dangerous, someone who'd walked into hell and come back breathing. "It's exactly because I'm pregnant that I have to do this." Her voice carried authority he'd never heard before. "Whatever's up there, it's been waiting for me, for the baby. Running won't solve anything." The footsteps resumed, moving toward what sounded like the eastern wall. Sarah closed her eyes, mentally mapping the tower's layout from memory. The second floor would be largely open, with maybe a small chamber or two built into the thickness of the walls. Above that, a third level that was probably nothing more than a platform with arrow slits. If something was making its home here, it would most likely be on the second floor. She pulled the iron pendant from beneath her shirt, a protective charm she'd never stopped wearing despite leaving the field. The metal was warm against her palm, almost hot. That was either very good or very bad, and she suspected she knew which. The first step on the stone staircase was slick with moisture and decay. Sarah tested each foothold carefully, one hand trailing along the wall for balance, the other clutching the pendant. Behind her, Marcus followed with obvious reluctance, his breathing too loud in the confined space. Halfway up, they encountered the first real sign of the tower's current inhabitant. Scratches gouged deep into the stone wall, forming symbols that made Sarah's vision blur when she tried to focus on them. She'd seen similar markings before in a basement in Prague where 3 people had died. Binding symbols meant to anchor something to a specific location. The scratches were fresh. "Christ," Marcus breathed, following her gaze. "What is this place?" Before Sarah could answer, the footsteps above stopped entirely. The silence stretched out, thick and oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of wind through the tower's upper reaches. Then, from somewhere directly ahead, came a voice. "Sarah?" A name spoken in a tone that was almost conversational, almost human. Except, voices didn't carry that well through solid stone, and the acoustic properties of the stairwell made it impossible to determine where the sound had originated. "I've been waiting so long," the voice continued, and now she could hear the wrongness in it. Syllables that didn't quite fit together, an intonation that suggested a throat not meant for human speech. "The child will be magnificent." Marcus grabbed her shoulder, trying to pull her back down the stairs, but Sarah shrugged him off. Her investigator's instincts were fully engaged now, cutting through fear with clinical precision. This entity was intelligent, capable of speech, and it knew English. That suggested either a human spirit with retained consciousness or something that had learned language through long observation of the living. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. "What do you want?" she called out, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Laughter echoed down from above, dry rustling sound like autumn leaves stirred by wind. When it faded, the voice spoke again, and this time it was definitely coming from the second floor. "To give you what you've always wanted, Sarah. A child who will never be ordinary." The baby kicked once, hard enough to make her gasp, and then went still again. The basement door stood ajar, though Sarah was certain she'd locked it the night before. Cold air seeped through the gap, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something that made her stomach clench with more than just morning sickness. She pressed her back against the kitchen counter, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. The baby had been unusually active since dawn, as if responding to some disturbance she couldn't perceive. Her old equipment bag sat on the table where she'd left it after last night's investigation. Its contents spilled across the scarred wood like accusations. The EMF detector was still beeping softly, its red lights pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat. She'd never seen readings this consistent before. Usually electromagnetic fields fluctuated, spiked and faded. This was different. This was steady, purposeful, alive. Sarah forced herself to approach the basement door. Through the gap she could see the wooden steps disappearing into darkness. The temperature drop was immediate and sharp, raising goosebumps along her arms despite her thick sweater. She pushed the door wider, and it swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo from impossibly far below. The basement stretched deeper than it should have, given the tower's footprint. Sarah flicked on her flashlight, its beam revealing stone walls that glistened with moisture. The stairs were older than the rest of the structure, carved directly into the bedrock. Each step down felt like a descent into something primordial, something that predated the tower by centuries. At the bottom, her light swept across a circular chamber she hadn't seen during yesterday's cursory exploration. The walls were covered in symbols carved deep into the stone and filled with what looked like dried blood. They weren't random scratches, these were deliberate, organized, telling a story she didn't want to understand. In the center of the chamber sat a chair. It was crude, fashioned from blackened wood and metal restraints, positioned to face a series of shelves carved into the far wall. The shelves held jars, dozens of them, each filled with cloudy liquid and something floating inside. Sarah's trained eye recognized preservation techniques, though these specimens were unlike anything she'd encountered in her paranormal investigations. She moved closer, fighting waves of nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. The jars contained what appeared to be organic matter, tissue samples, organs, things that might once have been human but were now transformed into something else entirely. At the center of the highest shelf sat a larger container, its contents more developed, more recognizable. It was a fetus, but wrong in every conceivable way. Extra limbs sprouted from its torso, and its face bore features that belonged to no earthly creature. Its eyes were open, and Sarah could swear they tracked her movement as she stumbled backward. The EMF detector in her pocket began shrieking. The temperature plummeted further, and her breath came out in visible puffs. Behind her, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stone stairs, slow, deliberate, descending. Sarah spun around, but the stairway was empty. The footsteps continued, growing closer, accompanied now by a wet, sliding sound like something being dragged across stone. Her flashlight beam wavered as her hands began to shake, casting wild shadows across the chamber walls. The symbols on the wall seemed to pulse with their own light now. a sickly phosphorescence that made the carved lines appear to writhe like living things. The baby inside her kicked violently, and she gasped at the sudden sharp pain that shot through her abdomen. "You shouldn't have come down here," a voice whispered from somewhere in the darkness beyond her light. It was a woman's voice, cultured and refined, but hollow, as if spoken from the bottom of a well. Sarah raised her flashlight higher, sweeping it across the chamber. Nothing. Just the shelves, the chair, and those horrible specimens floating in their eternal suspension. "We've been waiting so long," the voice continued, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "So many failed attempts, so many disappointments. But you're different. You understand our work." "I understand nothing," Sarah managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this place? What do you want?" Laughter echoed through the chamber, a sound like breaking glass. "What we want is what you carry, what we've always wanted. A vessel pure enough, strong enough to hold what we've created. Your child will be magnificent." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah doubled over with pain. When she straightened, she wasn't alone in the chamber. A figure stood between her and the stairs, tall, gaunt, wearing the rotted remains of what might once have been an expensive dress. Its face was a ruin of decay and surgical modification, but its eyes burned with an intelligence that was utterly mad. "Welcome home, Sarah," the creature said, and smiled with far too many teeth. The basement door stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. Sarah gripped the iron cross so tightly it left marks in her palm, its weight both comforting and terrifyingly inadequate. The whispers had stopped, but the silence felt worse, pregnant with malevolent anticipation. She descended one step at a time, each creak of the wooden stairs echoing through the darkness below. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing stone walls slick with moisture and something else, dark stains that looked suspiciously organic. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the scent of decay and something sweetly rotten that made her stomach lurch. The basement was larger than she'd expected, stretching beyond the reach of her light. Ancient support beams crossed overhead like ribs, and she realized with growing horror that the entire tower was built around this space. This was the heart of it all. "Sarah!" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to her bones. "You've kept us waiting so long." Her baby kicked frantically, as if trying to climb higher in her womb, away from whatever lurked in the darkness. Sarah pressed her free hand to her belly, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. "Who are you?" she called out, hating how her voice shook. "What do you want?" Laughter rippled through the air, the sound of wind through dry leaves, of children playing games with rules only they understood. "We are the forgotten ones, the taken ones, the promised ones. And you brought us exactly what we need." The flashlight beam caught something pale in the far corner. Sarah moved closer, her investigator's instincts warring with every survival instinct screaming at her to run. What she found made her knees buckle. Bones, small ones, arranged in careful patterns across the stone floor, dozens of them, maybe more, forming concentric circles around a raised platform that looked disturbingly like an altar. But it wasn't the bones that made her gorge rise. It was the realization of what they represented. "Children, babies, you see now," the voice whispered, closer than before. "You understand the legacy you've inherited." "No." Sarah backed away from the horrible display, her light dancing wildly across the walls. "This ends with me. I won't let you have my child." "Won't let us?" The temperature plummeted, and Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs. "Dear Sarah, you don't understand. We don't take what isn't freely given." Something moved in the shadows beyond her light. Multiple somethings, shifting with the rustle of old fabric and the soft pad of bare feet on stone. Sarah spun around, but the darkness seemed to shift and flow around her beam like living smoke. "Every mother who came before you made the same choice," the voice continued, and now she could see them, translucent figures emerging from the walls themselves, Women in clothing from different eras, all bearing the same hollow expression of grief and guilt. They all thought they could resist. They all thought they could protect what was theirs. But the hunger grows. Another voice joined in, this one belonging to a woman in a Victorian dress, her face gaunt with sorrow. It spreads. It consumes everything. "Until there's nothing left but the choice," added another, her medieval robes tattered and stained. "Feed it what it wants, or watch it devour everything you love." Sarah raised the iron cross, its surface burning cold against her palm. The ghostly figures recoiled slightly, but their expressions remained pitying rather than afraid. "That trinket won't save you," the first voice laughed. "We tried everything. Crosses, salt, prayers, sage, none of it matters when the hunger calls." "Then why?" Sarah demanded, backing toward what she hoped was still the staircase. "Why help it? Why give up your children?" The temperature dropped further, and frost began forming on the stone walls. When the lead figure spoke again, her voice carried the weight of centuries of anguish. "'Cause if we didn't, it would have taken everything. Our husbands, our other children, our entire bloodlines consumed to satisfy what we refuse to give freely. One life to save all the others. What choice is that?" Sarah's back hit the staircase railing, and she nearly sobbed with relief. But as she started to climb, the voices followed her, growing more insistent. "You feel it growing stronger, don't you? The pull, the whispers, the way shadows move when they shouldn't. It's already begun, Sarah. The only question is how many others you'll let it destroy before you accept the inevitable." She ran then, taking the stairs 3 at a time despite her bulk, the iron cross clutched in one hand and the failing flashlight in the other. Behind her, the laughter of dead mothers echoed through the darkness, a sound that would haunt her dreams if she lived long enough to sleep again. The basement door slammed shut behind her with a finality that shook the entire tower. The journal's pages crackled like autumn leaves as Sarah turned them, her flashlight casting wavering shadows across Marcus Blackwood's spidery handwriting. Each entry drew her deeper into a nightmare that had begun over 60 years ago, when Marcus first encountered the entity that now stalked her through these decaying halls. October 15th, 1962. The presence grows stronger. It speaks to me in dreams, promises of power beyond imagination, if I can provide what it seeks. The barrier between worlds is thin here, thinner than I ever imagined when I bought this accursed place. Sarah's hands trembled as she read on, recognizing the progression she'd seen before in other cases, the gradual corruption of a human mind by something ancient and hungry. But Marcus hadn't been an innocent victim. He'd been a willing participant. November 3rd, 1962. Margaret is with child. Perfect timing. The entity grows restless, and I fear what might happen if its patience runs out. She suspects nothing of my true purpose in bringing her here. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Margaret, Marcus's wife, the woman whose voice she'd heard crying in the walls, whose spirit seemed trapped in this place just as surely as the thing that had consumed her child. The floorboards creaked overhead, a slow, deliberate pacing that made Sarah's skin crawl. Something was moving up there, circling like a predator. She forced herself to focus on the journal, knowing the answers she needed lay somewhere in Marcus's confessions. December 20th, 1962. Margaret delivered this morning. A perfect, beautiful daughter. For a moment, holding her, I almost reconsidered. But the pact is made, and the entity will not be denied. Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark, I will complete the ritual. Sarah's breath caught. She flipped frantically to the next entry, but the page was torn, only fragments remaining. The writing that followed was in a different hand, shakier, more desperate. December 22nd, 1962. It's done, and God forgive me, it's done. But something went wrong. The entity took my child, yes, but not as we agreed. Instead of passing through to our world fully, it became trapped, bound to this place by Margaret's dying curse. She knew. Somehow, she knew what I intended, and with her last breath, she bound us all here together. The pacing above stopped abruptly. Sarah held her breath, listening to the oppressive silence that followed. Then, clear as a bell, she heard a baby crying. Her own child kicked frantically inside her, responding to some primal fear that transcended the womb. Sarah pressed a hand to her belly, whispering words of protection she'd learned years ago from a Cherokee medicine woman. The crying stopped, but the silence that replaced it was somehow worse. January 15th, 1963. I understand now why the entity chose this place, chose me. The tower was built on old ground, sacred ground, where the barriers between worlds have always been permeable. But Margaret's binding has created a paradox. The entity feeds on life force, on potential, but it cannot leave to seek new victims. It must wait for them to come to it. And it can wait forever. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't random. Her finding this place, the impossibly low price, even her pregnancy, it was all connected. The entity had been calling to her, drawing her here just as it had drawn others before her. But Marcus's journal revealed something else, something that sent a spark of hope through her growing despair. Margaret hadn't just cursed the entity, she'd weakened it. The binding that trapped it here also limited its power, forced it to work through manipulation and fear rather than direct force. A new sound echoed through the chamber. Footsteps on the spiral stairs, heavy and deliberate. But these weren't the ghostly footfalls she'd heard before. These were solid, real, accompanied by the scrape of something being dragged. Sarah snapped off her flashlight and pressed herself against the cold stone wall, clutching the journal to her chest. The footsteps grew closer, and with them came a smell she remembered from her days investigating the supernatural. The metallic tang of fresh blood mixed with something older. Something rotten. Light flickered in the stairwell, not the clean beam of a flashlight, but the wavering glow of candlelight. Someone was coming down the stairs, someone very much alive, but that thought brought no comfort. In her experience, the living were often more dangerous than the dead. The footsteps stopped just outside the chamber. Sarah could hear breathing now, labored and wet, as if the person was injured. Then came a voice, so distorted by damage and time that it took her a moment to recognize it as human. "Sarah," it whispered, her name twisted into something obscene by ruined vocal cords. "I've been waiting so long to meet you. We have so much to discuss." The candlelight grew brighter, casting dancing shadows on the chamber walls, and Sarah realized with growing horror that she was about to come face to face with someone who should have been dead for decades. The basement walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy as Sarah descended the crumbling stone steps, her flashlight beam dancing across ancient symbols carved deep into the rock. Each step downward made her baby kick more violently, as if sensing the approaching danger. The iron pendant Marcus had given her grew ice-cold against her chest, the only thing standing between her and whatever lurked in the depths below. "I know you can hear me," she called out, her voice echoing through the subterranean chambers. "I know what you are, what you want, but you can't have my child." A low chuckle reverberated from the shadows ahead. Neither fully male nor female, but something far older and infinitely more patient. "Oh, my dear Sarah, you think your little trinkets and half-remembered rituals can stop what has been set in motion for decades." The temperature plummeted as she reached the bottom of the stairs. Her breath came out in white puffs as she swept her flashlight across the chamber. The beam revealed a circular room carved from living rock, its walls covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. At the center sat an ornate stone chair, stained dark with substances she didn't want to identify. 17 women before you," the voice continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. 17 children who fed my return to this realm. Your child will be the 18th, the final offering that grants me permanent form." Sarah's blood ran cold. "The missing women from town, you took them. They came willingly. In the end, drawn here by dreams, by whispers, by promises of purpose. Just as you were drawn here, Sarah Chen, former scourge of spirits and hunter of the supernatural, Did you really think it was coincidence that brought you to my tower? She pressed her back against the wall, flashlight trembling in her grip. The carved symbols seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light now, and she could feel something massive stirring in the darkness beyond her beam's reach. "You've been planning this," she whispered. "The real estate listing, the price, everything was designed to bring me here. A pregnant woman with the sight, with knowledge of the old ways, perfect for my needs. Your paranormal experience means you can see me fully, feed me more completely, and your child," the voice grew hungry, "your child will be born with abilities that will make the transfer of power so much more substantial." Sarah's mind raced through everything Marcus had taught her about entities like this. Powerful spirits needed anchors to the physical world, and what better anchor than a newborn with psychic potential? She thought of the journal entries she'd found, the previous women's desperate final words, their growing obsession with feeding something that promised them purpose. "You made them worship you," she said. "You convinced them their sacrifice mattered." It did matter. Each child brought me closer to corporeal form. Soon I won't need this crumbling tower, won't be bound to these ancient stones. I'll walk freely in your world, and others like me will follow. The darkness shifted, and Sarah caught glimpses of something vast and terrible taking shape in the shadows. Too many limbs, too many angles, a form that her human mind struggled to process. The iron pendant burned against her skin, the only thing keeping the entity from fully manifesting. "But first," the voice purred, "you need to understand your role. You'll carry my child to term, birth it in that chair where so many others have served their purpose. And when the moment comes, you'll offer the infant willingly, because by then you'll see the glory of what you're helping to create." Sarah felt a creeping sensation in her mind, whispers trying to take root, promising her that surrender would bring peace, that her child's sacrifice would serve a greater purpose. She recognized the psychic manipulation, the way entities like this work to break down human will. "No," she said firmly, gripping the pendant through her shirt. "I've faced things like you before. I know your tricks." The temperature dropped even further, and the entity's form solidified slightly, revealing glimpses of something that had never been human, something that predated human civilization entirely. "You faced lesser spirits, parlor tricks and angry ghosts," it snarled. "I am primordial, a force that existed when your ancestors cowered in caves. Your pendant won't protect you forever, and when it fails—" Sarah felt the iron growing weaker, its protective influence waning. She needed to act soon, before the entity gained enough power to overcome her defenses entirely. The journal had mentioned a ritual, something about breaking the binding that kept the spirit anchored to this place. As the darkness pressed closer and her baby's kicks grew more frantic, Sarah realized she had one chance to save them both. But it would require her to do something she'd sworn never to do again, tap into the same psychic abilities that had nearly destroyed her years ago. The entity's laughter filled the chamber as it sensed her fear. "Yes, child. Embrace what you truly are." The basement stretched deeper than Sarah had imagined possible, carved stone corridors branching off into impenetrable darkness. Her flashlight beam trembled as she descended the narrow stairs, each step echoing with hollow finality. The whispers had stopped the moment she'd crossed the threshold, leaving behind a silence so complete it made her ears ring. Marcus followed close behind, his breathing harsh and labored. The thing wearing her husband's face had grown more erratic in the past hour, occasionally stumbling or tilting its head at unnatural angles, as if the entity controlling him was losing its grip. "Sarah," it spoke, voice layered with harmonics that didn't belong to human vocal cords. "You're making this so much harder than it needs to be." She didn't respond, focusing instead on the symbols carved into the walls. They were older than anything she'd encountered before, predating even the most ancient texts she'd studied during her paranormal investigation days. The markings seemed to shift in her peripheral vision, writhing like living things when she wasn't looking directly at them. The corridor opened into a vast circular chamber. its domed ceiling lost in shadows beyond her flashlight's reach. At the center stood a stone altar, its surface stained with dark patches that might have been rust or dried blood. Around it, arranged in concentric circles, were dozens of wooden cradles in various stages of decay. Sarah's breath caught. Some of the cradles held bundles of cloth, small forms wrapped in fabric that had long since turned to rot. Others contained only bones, infant skeletons yellowed with age. "Now you understand," the thing behind her whispered, and Sarah felt not Marcus's, hands settle on her shoulders. "This place has served its purpose for centuries. The entity that dwells here feeds on potential, on the pure life force that exists only in the moments between conception and first breath. It has waited so patiently." Sarah shrugged away from the touch, stepping closer to the altar. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing the wrongness of this place. "How many children?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Dozens, perhaps hundreds. Time moves differently here. The tower calls to those who are desperate pregnant women with nowhere else to turn. They come seeking shelter, and they provide sustenance." She turned to face the creature, forcing herself to look into eyes that were Marcus's but held no recognition, no warmth. "But I'm different, aren't I? That's why you're having trouble with him." She gestured at her husband's twitching form. "I have protection you weren't expecting." A smile spread across the familiar features, but it was too wide, stretching Marcus's mouth into something grotesque. "Protection, yes. Your years of investigation left their mark. But even protected souls can be persuaded." The shadows around the chamber began to move, coalescing into vaguely human shapes. Sarah counted at least a dozen figures emerging from the darkness, their forms translucent and wavering. The spirits of the mothers who had come before, she realized, the ones who had given birth on that stone altar and never left. "They tried to resist too," the entity continued, speaking through Marcus's mouth. "In the end, they all made the same choice. They understood that their children would serve a greater purpose." One of the spirits drifted closer, and Sarah could make out her features, a young woman, maybe 20, with hollow eyes and a mouth open in a silent scream. The ghost reached out with spectral fingers, and Sarah felt a chill pass through her as the touch connected. Images flooded her mind. The woman arriving at the tower, heavily pregnant and fleeing an abusive husband. The gradual realization that something was wrong. The final moments on the altar as the entity fed not just on her child, but on her life force as well, trapping her spirit to serve as a lure for the next victim. Sarah gasped, pulling back from the ghost's touch. "No," she said firmly, "I won't be another one of your victims." "You don't have a choice," the entity snarled, and Marcus's body began to convulse. "The ritual has already begun. The moment you entered this chamber, the bindings activated. You cannot leave." Sarah felt it then, a pulling sensation, as if something was trying to draw her toward the altar. Her feet moved against her will, shuffling across the stone floor. The protective wards she'd carried for years were struggling against whatever force held this place. But she'd learned more than just protection during her years investigating the paranormal. She'd learned how to fight back. Reaching into her jacket pocket, Sarah pulled out a small leather pouch, salt mixed with herbs and blessed by 3 different religious traditions. She'd started carrying it again the moment she'd realized the tower was truly haunted. "You want my child," she said, her voice growing stronger. "But you forgot something important about me." The entity controlling Marcus tilted his head, curious despite its confidence. "I've sent things like you back to hell before," Sarah continued, breaking the pouch open and letting the consecrated salt spill across her palm. "And I'll do it again." The spirits around her began to wail. The static from Marcus's radio crackled through the stone chamber as Sarah pressed herself against the cold wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. The entity's laughter had faded, but she could feel its presence everywhere, in the shadows that seemed to breathe, in the way the air itself felt thick and malevolent. "Sarah, if you can hear this, we're in the basement." Marcus's voice was strained, barely audible through the interference. "There's something down here. Symbols carved into the walls and... Christ, Sarah, there are bones. Small ones." Her blood turned to ice. The basement. She'd never been able to access it. The door had always been sealed, rusted shut. But of course, the entity would show Marcus what it wanted him to see, what it wanted her to know. The baby kicked violently, as if responding to her terror, and Sarah gasped, doubling over. The movement felt different now, more urgent, almost desperate, as if her child was trying to fight against something from within. "The children," she whispered, understanding flooding through her with sickening clarity. "You've done this before." The temperature plummeted, and her breath began to mist. Ice crystals formed on the stone walls as the entity's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Decades of waiting," it hissed. "Decades of failed attempts. But you came willingly, Sarah Chen. You brought me exactly what I need." She forced herself to stand straighter, reaching for the EMF detector in her jacket pocket. The device immediately screamed to life, its readings spiking far beyond anything she'd ever recorded. But knowledge was power, even against something like this. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "What do you want with my baby?" The darkness seemed to coalesce in front of her, taking shape but never quite solidifying. A writhing mass of shadow and malice, with eyes like burning coals. When it spoke, she could smell decay and centuries of rage. "I was like you once. Flesh and blood and desperate hunger. I came here pregnant, fled here when they would have burned me for what I carried. But the child was special, touched by something beyond this world." Sarah's investigator instincts kicked in despite her terror. "You gave birth here." "I died here," the entity spat, in agony alone, while the child consumed me from within. It took everything, my life, my flesh, my soul, but it wasn't enough, never enough. So I waited, bound to this place by my own rage and its endless hunger." The pieces clicked into place with horrible certainty. "You've been feeding it. All these years you've been trying to feed it other children." None were right, the entity wailed, and the sound was like breaking glass in Sarah's ears. "None carried the gift. But yours. I can smell the power in your bloodline, Sarah Chen, the sensitivity that made you so good at hunting things like me. Your child will be perfect." Marcus's voice crackled through the radio again, urgent and terrified. "Sarah, get out of here. The symbols, they're moving, changing, and there's something coming up from the lower levels. Something." The transmission cut to static, then silence. Sarah's training took over, suppressing the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She'd faced malevolent spirits before, entities that fed on fear and despair. But nothing like this. Nothing with decades to plan and grow stronger. The baby's movements were becoming more frantic now, and she felt a strange pulling sensation, as if something was trying to draw the life force from her womb. She pressed both hands to her belly protectively. "You can't have my child," she said firmly. "I won't let you." The entity's laughter was like nails on stone. "You think you have a choice? You came here willingly. You bought this place, made it yours. By the old laws, by the rules that bind such things, you've given me permission." Sarah's mind raced. Permission. Invitation. In her investigations, she'd learned that the most powerful entities often needed consent, needed to be welcomed in somehow. The purchase, the legal transfer of ownership, it had been a binding ritual she'd walked into blindly. But there had to be a way to break it. There was always a way. "The contract can be voided," she said, grasping for legal knowledge that felt absurd in the face of supernatural horror. "If one party misrepresented the terms. You let me believe I was buying an abandoned building." The entity's form flickered, and for a moment its confidence seemed to waver. "Clever girl, but it's too late. The process has already begun." Sarah felt it then, a cold tendril of something alien touching her mind, probing, seeking entry. The baby's kicks became almost violent, and she realized with mounting horror that the entity wasn't lying. Something was happening. some connection being forged between the ancient hunger and her unborn child. She had to get to Marcus, had to find those symbols he'd mentioned. If this thing had used ritual magic to bind itself here, there might be a way to use that same magic against it. But first, she had to survive whatever was climbing up from the depths below. Sarah's hands trembled as she traced the final symbol on the tower's stone floor, her blood mixing with the ancient chalk marks she'd discovered beneath decades of grime. The entity's presence pressed against her consciousness like a physical weight, its hunger growing more insistent with each passing moment. Through the narrow windows, dawn was still hours away, but she couldn't wait any longer. The ritual circle was nearly complete, not the summoning circle she'd initially thought, but something far more complex. A binding circle designed to trap whatever had been feeding off the tower's dark history. She'd found the instructions carved into the walls of the basement chamber, hidden beneath layers of mold and decay. The previous owner hadn't been trying to summon the entity, he'd been trying to contain it. "You think you understand," the voice whispered, no longer bothering to disguise itself as her grandmother's gentle tone. Now it sounded like grinding stone and winter wind. "But you're already too late." Sarah pressed her hand to her swollen belly, feeling the baby's restless movements. Ever since she'd begun preparing the ritual, her daughter had been unusually active, as if sensing the supernatural tension building around them. "I know what you are," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her fear. "You're not some ancient demon. You're a parasite." The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows, and Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs. The entity's rage was palpable, but beneath it she sensed something else, desperation. "The families who lived here before," she continued, placing the final component of the ritual at the circle's center, an iron nail she'd pried from one of the tower's original beams. "They didn't all die from accidents or illness, did they? You fed on their children, their hope, their life force. But you never had enough. You're starving." The shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe and coalesce, forming a vaguely humanoid shape that towered over her. Its eyes were holes in reality itself, and when it spoke, the words seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I have waited so long," it said. "Decades of emptiness, of hunger. Your child carries such power, such potential. She will sustain me for centuries." Sarah stood, fighting against the wave of nausea that washed over her. The binding ritual required her own life force to power it, and she could feel the energy draining from her body. But she'd known the cost when she'd made this choice. "That's where you're wrong. She's not yours to take." She began to recite the incantation she'd memorized, words in a language that predated any human civilization. The chalk lines began to glow with a soft blue light, and the iron nail grew white-hot. The entity shrieked, a sound that shattered several of the tower's ancient windows. "You cannot bind me," it roared. "I am older than your bloodline, older than your species. I have claimed 12 children from this place." "But you never claimed them all," Sarah gasped, pushing more of her strength into the binding. "Some escaped, some fought back. That's why you're so weak now, isn't it? You've been surviving on scraps for decades." The entity lunged toward her, but the glowing circle held it back. Its form flickered and wavered, becoming less solid with each passing moment. Sarah could see through it now, could see the desperate, pathetic thing it really was, not a mighty demon, but a dying parasite clinging to existence. Her daughter kicked hard against her ribs, and suddenly Sarah felt a surge of energy that wasn't her own. The baby was somehow feeding power into the ritual, her unborn life force joining with Sarah's in a way that should have been impossible. The blue light intensified, spreading beyond the circle to encompass the entire room. "No," the entity whispered, its voice fading. "She was promised to me. The tower calls to those who carry power. She belongs here." "She belongs with me," Sarah said firmly. The binding circle was almost complete now, its light burning away decades of psychic residue that had accumulated in the tower's stones. "And when this is over, we're both leaving. Forever." The entity made one last desperate attempt to break free, throwing its remaining strength against the barriers Sarah had erected. The tower shook, ancient timbers groaning under the supernatural assault. Plaster rained down from the ceiling, and several stones in the walls cracked under the pressure. But the circle held. With a final, anguished wail, the entity collapsed in on itself, its form compressing down to a single point of darkness that the binding ritual quickly contained. The iron nail glowed brighter for a moment, then went dark. The supernatural cold lifted from the room, replaced by the normal chill of a winter night. Sarah sank to her knees, exhausted but victorious. Her daughter's movements had calmed, settling into the gentle rhythm Sarah had grown accustomed to over the past months. They had won, for now, but as she looked around the damaged tower, Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The entity's scream shattered every remaining window in the tower, sending glass cascading down like deadly rain. Sarah pressed herself against the stone wall, feeling the ancient structure shudder around her as the thing that had been Evangeline writhed in the center of the ritual chamber, its form flickering between woman and shadow. "You cannot destroy what has already died," it shrieked, its voice layering over itself in harmonics that made Sarah's teeth ache. "I have waited too long, sacrificed too much." Sarah clutched the iron pendant Marcus had given her, feeling its weight grow warm against her palm. The protective circle she'd carved into the floor with her knife was holding but barely. The salt lines were already beginning to smoke and dissolve under the entity's assault. Her baby kicked frantically, as if sensing the danger. Sarah placed her free hand on her belly, whispering the protection chant Marcus had taught her years ago. The words felt rusty on her tongue, but they came back with desperate clarity. The entity's form solidified, taking on Evangeline's appearance once more, but this version was wrong, corrupted. Her elegant dress hung in tatters, revealing grey skin mottled with decay. Her eyes were black voids that seemed to pull at Sarah's soul. "Your child will complete what mine could not," Evangeline hissed, gliding closer to the circle's edge. "Through your blood, through your pain, I will finally cross over completely. I will live again." "Like hell," Sarah snarled, pulling the second iron pendant from her pocket, the one she'd taken from the nursery. She'd suspected its significance, and now she was certain. "This belonged to your daughter, didn't it? The one you tried to use as an anchor before." Evangeline's facade flickered, revealing something monstrous underneath. "Give that to me." "She fought you off somehow, didn't she?" Sarah continued, backing toward the narrow window. "Your own daughter. She died rather than let you use her soul to cross over." She was weak. The entity lunged forward but stopped at the circle's edge, its form rippling like water. "Ungrateful. I gave her everything, and she chose death over helping her mother." Sarah felt the truth click into place. "You killed her. You performed the ritual on your own daughter, but she found a way to bind you here instead. That's why you needed the tower's new bloodline, why you've been waiting for someone like me." The admission seemed to drain some of Evangeline's power. Her form became translucent, wavering. "She bound me with her dying breath, tied my essence to this place. But the binding weakens with each generation. Your child will break it entirely." Sarah stepped back, feeling the stone windowsill against her spine. 30 feet down to the rocky ground below. Even if she survived the fall, would it matter? The entity would simply wait for the next pregnant woman, the next opportunity. But then she noticed something else. Carved symbols around the window frame, worn smooth by centuries of weather. Protection sigils, barely visible but definitely there. The daughter's work, most likely. The girl had tried to create escape routes, safe passages. "You're not the only one who can perform a binding ritual," Sarah said, raising both pendants. The iron grew hot in her hands, almost burning. "And I'm not as helpless as your daughter was." She began to speak in Latin, dredging up half-remembered exorcism rites from her paranormal investigation days. The words weren't perfect, but her intent was clear and desperate. The iron pendants began to glow with a pale light. Evangeline shrieked and threw herself against the protective circle. The salt lines exploded outward in bursts of white fire. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll trap us both." "Maybe," Sarah admitted, feeling the ritual's power building around her. The tower itself seemed to respond, the ancient stones humming with energy. "But at least my child will be safe." The entity's form began to stretch and distort, pulled in multiple directions. The iron pendants were acting like anchors, but instead of binding Evangeline to the physical world, they were dragging her deeper into whatever realm she'd been trying to escape. "This isn't over," Evangeline gasped, her voice fading. "The bloodline, the connection, it will always—" But her words dissolved into whispers, then silence. The oppressive weight that had filled the tower for months suddenly lifted. Sarah could breathe again, really breathe, without feeling like something was pressing against her lungs. She slumped against the windowsill, exhausted. The iron pendants were cold now, ordinary metal once more. Outside, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus felt something shift. "Are you all right?" Sarah smiled weakly as she typed back, "It's over. The binding held." But even as she sent the message, she couldn't shake the feeling that Evangeline's final words had been more than just empty threats. The bloodline connection. What exactly did that mean for her child's future? The basement ceiling groaned under the weight of the entity's rage above, plaster dust raining down like snow as Sarah pressed her back against the cold stone wall. Her flashlight beam wavered across the ritual circle she'd spent the last hour perfecting, salt mixed with iron filings creating an intricate pattern of protection around the makeshift altar she'd constructed from broken furniture and debris. The baby kicked violently, as if sensing what was coming. Sarah placed a trembling hand on her swollen belly, whispering words of comfort she didn't believe herself. The ancient grimoire lay open beside her, its yellowed pages fluttering in the unnatural wind that had begun to whistle through the basement's cracks and crevices. Above, something massive crashed against the floor, sending vibrations through the entire tower. The entity knew what she was planning. It could feel the power building in the ritual space, could sense that its decades of patient waiting might come to nothing. Sarah began to chant, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony from above. The Latin words felt foreign on her tongue, despite having practiced them countless times during her investigator days. But this was different. This wasn't about gathering evidence or documenting phenomena. This was about survival. The temperature plummeted. Her breath came out in white puffs as she continued the incantation, each word seeming to echo with power that made her teeth ache. The salt circle began to glow with a faint blue light, and she felt the familiar tingle of supernatural energy responding to her call. Heavy footsteps thundered down the basement stairs. Not footsteps exactly, more like the sound of something massive and formless trying to mimic human movement. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more confident, as she reached the crucial passage in the banishment ritual. The thing that appeared at the bottom of the stairs bore no resemblance to the sad, lost woman it had once pretended to be. Its form shifted constantly, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that seemed to absorb the light from her flashlight. Only its eyes remained constant, burning red coals that fixed on Sarah with predatory intensity. "You cannot banish me, child," it spoke with a voice like grinding stone. "I've waited too long, fed too well on the despair that seeps from these walls. Your child will be born here, and I will take what is rightfully mine." Sarah's response was to raise her voice, pouring every ounce of determination into the ancient words. The ritual circle flared brighter, and the entity recoiled as if burned. But it didn't retreat. Instead, it began to circle the protective barrier, testing for weaknesses, its form growing more solid with each passing moment. The baby's movements became frantic, and Sarah gasped as a sharp pain shot through her abdomen. Not now. She couldn't go into labor now, not when she was so close to completing the ritual. She forced herself to focus, to push through the discomfort and continue the incantation. The entity struck without warning, hurling itself against the salt circle with tremendous force. The protective barrier held, but Sarah could see cracks beginning to form in the glowing lines. She had minutes at most before her defenses collapsed entirely. Switching to the binding portion of the ritual, she pulled out the iron spike she'd prepared earlier, its surface etched with symbols of containment. The entity seemed to recognize the object and let out a howl of rage that made the basement walls tremble. "You think your parlor tricks can contain me?" it snarled, striking the barrier again. More cracks appeared, spiderwebbing across the circle's perimeter. "I am older than your bloodline, older than your precious books and ceremonies." Sarah ignored its taunts, focusing on the spike in her hands. She had to time this perfectly. The binding would only work if she could anchor the entity to a physical object, trap it in the material world where it would be vulnerable to banishment. But to do that, she had to lower the protective circle and expose herself to its attack. Another contraction hit, this one strong enough to double her over. The entity sensed her weakness and pressed its assault, the red glow of its eyes intensifying as it prepared for a final strike. With a prayer on her lips, Sarah shattered the salt circle with a sweep of her foot. The entity lunged forward with inhuman speed, but she was ready. As its shadowy form enveloped her, she drove the iron spike deep into the basement stone floor, speaking the words of binding with desperate urgency. The entity's scream of rage and pain was deafening. Its form began to contract, pulled inexorably toward the spike as the binding took hold. Sarah felt its claws rake across her arms as it fought the magical compulsion, but the ancient iron held firm. Now came the hardest part. With the entity bound, she had to complete the banishment before her strength gave out entirely. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not. The tower groaned around Sarah as she pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her hand instinctively covering her swollen belly. The entity that had called itself Margaret Blackthorne materialized fully now, no longer hiding behind shadows and whispers. Its form was grotesque, part woman, part something else entirely, with elongated fingers that ended in yellowed claws and eyes that burned with ancient hunger. "You cannot keep what was promised to me," Margaret hissed, her voice echoing from the very stones themselves. "I have waited 67 years for another child to grace these walls. Your baby will complete the ritual that was interrupted so long ago." Sarah's mind raced through everything she'd learned about the tower's history. The missing children, the occult symbols carved into the foundation stones, the way the building itself seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. She'd been a paranormal investigator once, before David died, before she'd sworn off the supernatural world forever. But now, with her child's life hanging in the balance, those old skills came flooding back. "The ritual," Sarah said, buying time as she reached into her bag with trembling fingers. "Tell me about the ritual, Margaret. What did you really do to those children?" Margaret's laugh was like breaking glass. "I gave them purpose. I gave them eternal life within these walls. They became part of something greater than their small, mortal existence." The entity drifted closer, and Sarah could smell decay and centuries of dust. "Your child will join them, and together they will feed my power for another century." Sarah's fingers found what she was looking for, a small vial of blessed salt she'd carried for years, a remnant from her investigating days that she'd never been able to throw away. "There's just one problem with your plan, Margaret." She uncorked the vial with her thumb. "I know what you really are." The entity paused, its burning eyes narrowing. "You're not Margaret Blackthorne," Sarah continued, stepping away from the wall. "Margaret was the first victim, wasn't she? A young woman who came here pregnant and alone, just like me. But something else was already waiting in this tower, something that killed her and took her form, her identity, her hunger for children." Margaret's face contorted with rage. "You nothing!" "I know enough." Sarah threw the blessed salt in a wide arc around herself, creating a protective circle. The entity shrieked as the salt hit the floor, steam rising where it landed. "I know this tower was built on a convergence point. I know something demonic was bound here long before Margaret ever arrived. And I know you've been wearing her face like a mask, using her story to hide what you really are." The tower shuddered, and Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of children's laughter echoing from the walls themselves. Not joyful laughter, but something hollow and desperate, as if the sounds were being forced from unwilling throats. "They're still here," Sarah whispered, understanding flooding through her. "The children you took, their souls are trapped in the tower itself." Margaret's form began to shift and blur, revealing glimpses of something far more terrible underneath. "They serve me willingly now. They hunger as I hunger, and they will help me claim your child." The laughter grew louder, more insistent, and Sarah felt the temperature in the room plummet. Frost began forming on the windows, and her breath came out in visible puffs. But instead of fear, she felt a familiar determination settling over her, the same feeling she'd had when facing down malevolent spirits in her investigator days. "Then let's finish this," Sarah said, pulling out her phone and activating the recording app. "I banish you by your true name, by the power that bound you here, by the innocent blood you've spilled." She began reciting an exorcism ritual she'd memorized years ago, her voice growing stronger with each word. The entity that wore Margaret's face screamed, its form becoming more unstable. The tower itself seemed to convulse, stones grinding against each other as if the building were alive and in pain. But Sarah didn't stop. She continued the ritual, adding her own modifications, calling on the trapped children to break free, demanding that the convergence point be cleansed. Suddenly, the children's laughter changed. It became lighter, more genuine, and Sarah realized they were finally being released from their decades of torment. Points of light began appearing throughout the room, small glowing figures that looked at Sarah with gratitude before fading away into whatever came next. As the last child spirit disappeared, the demonic entity let out a final, ear-splitting shriek before imploding in on itself, leaving only empty air and the scent of sulfur. Sarah stood in the sudden silence, her hand still protectively covering her belly. The tower felt different now, empty but clean, like a wound that had finally been allowed to heal. She made her way carefully to the stairs, knowing that when she stepped outside, she would be free of the nightmare that had haunted this place for so long.